An emotional story of resilience, moving and powerful. A humble girl ran against the current and shouted, "I will not let you die." Her unlikely gesture turned a millionaire's world upside down, and you need to see what happened next. If you enjoy emotional stories, subscribe to the channel and comment where you are listening from. The rain hammered down on Riverside Falls, like the sky had finally decided to unleash every ounce of fury it had been holding back for months. It was late October, and the Cumberland River, usually a gentle companion to the small Tennessee town, had transformed into a raging beast that devoured streets, homes, and dreams with equal appetite. The muddy waters rose so fast that people barely had time to grab what mattered most before fleeing to higher ground. Furniture, children's toys, framed photographs that would never be seen again. All of it swept away in the merciless current that cared nothing for memories or meaning. In the Meadowbrook community, a cluster of modest homes that stretched along the riverbank, like wildflowers stubbornly growing in hard soil. Families huddled together on porches and rooftops, praying the flood wouldn't take the little they had left. And there, in that scene of desperation and fear, something happened that would change lives forever. Something that would prove once again that sometimes the smallest among us carry the biggest hearts. 13-year-old Maya Rodriguez stood at the edge of her grandfather's wooden dock, her dark eyes fixed on something the crowd of neighbors seemed determined to ignore. About 50 yards downstream, a black luxury sedan, a Mercedes, she thought, though she'd never been close enough to one to really know, was halfway submerged in the churning brown water, trapped against the concrete pillars of the old railroad bridge. The vehicle tilted at a sickening angle, its hood already under, the current pounding against its sides with such force that it shuddered like a living thing in its death throes. And inside, clearly visible through the driver's side window, was a man, his palms pressed against the glass, his mouth open in what Maya knew had to be screams for help, though the roar of the flood swallowed every sound. His face was pale with terror, his eyes wide and desperate as the water climbed higher inside the car, already past his chest. Maya looked around at the crowd gathered on the hillside behind her, maybe 30 people, all watching the same horrible scene unfold. But nobody moved, nobody even tried, and then she heard it. The voices, low at first, then growing bolder. "That's him," old Mr. Patterson said, his voice carrying that particular mix of satisfaction and bitterness that Maya had learned to recognize in adults who felt they'd been wronged. "That's Richard Donovan." The Donovan. "Let him drown," someone else muttered. Maya didn't see who. Maybe God's finally doing what the courts wouldn't. "My sister lost her home because of him," a woman's voice added, sharper now, almost gleeful. 3 generations in that house, and he bought the land out from under us for one of his shopping centers. So yeah, let the river have him. It's justice." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd like a dark wave, and Maya felt something twist inside her chest. She knew who Richard Donovan was. Everyone in Riverside Falls knew. He was the real estate developer, the millionaire businessman who'd spent the last 5 years buying up property along the river, tearing down neighborhoods to build luxury condos and commercial complexes that nobody in Meadowbrook could ever afford. He'd threatened to demolish their entire community just last month, claiming the land was prime development opportunity, and that people like them, people with dirt under their fingernails and second-hand clothes, didn't belong on waterfront property. Maya's own grandfather, Vicente Rodriguez, had refused to sell their small house and dock, no matter how much money Donovan offered or how many legal threats his lawyers sent. "This land," her abuelo had said, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing, "holds your grandmother's memory. No amount of money can buy that back." So yes, Maya knew exactly who Richard Donovan was. She knew what he represented, what he'd done, how many families he'd displaced without a second thought. She understood why the crowd stood frozen in bitter satisfaction, watching karma, or God, or fate, or whatever you wanted to call it, finally catch up with a man who seemed to believe money made him untouchable. But all Maya could see was a human being drowning. A person whose life was ticking away second by second while everyone else watched like it was entertainment. And something inside her, something her abuelo had always said was both her greatest strength and her biggest danger, simply wouldn't let her look away and do nothing. "Someone has to help him," Maya said, her voice small at first. The crowd didn't even turn around. "Someone has to help!" She shouted louder this time, her thin voice cracking with urgency. Mr. Patterson finally glanced back at her, his expression a mix of pity and annoyance. "Child, that man would bulldoze your house tomorrow without losing a minute of sleep. Why would you care if he—" But Maya wasn't listening anymore. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to break free, and her hands trembled as she kicked off her worn sneakers. Her grandfather's voice called out from somewhere behind her. "Maya, no!" But it sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. All she could hear was her own blood rushing in her ears, and a voice inside her head, clear and certain, saying, "You can't just watch someone die." "You can't. I won't let you die," Maya screamed toward the drowning man, though she knew he couldn't hear her over the roar of the flood. And then, before her mind could catch up with her body, before fear could root her feet to the dock, she dove. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and shocking every nerve in her body. The Cumberland's current grabbed her immediately, pulling her under, spinning her like she weighed nothing. Maya had grown up on this river, had learned to swim before she could properly read, but this wasn't the gentle water she knew. This was something primal and powerful, something that wanted to consume her. She kicked hard, breaking the surface, gasping for air. The current dragged her downstream faster than she'd expected, but she used it, angling her body toward the trapped car. Behind her she could hear shouting now, her grandfather's voice mixing with others, some calling her crazy, some screaming for her to come back, some finally yelling for someone to call 911. But Maya knew the truth in her bones. By the time help arrived, Richard Donovan would be dead. Her arms burned as she fought the current, swimming at an angle the way her abuelo had taught her during fishing trips. "Never fight the river head-on," he'd always said. "Move with it, work with it, and it'll take you where you need to go." The car loomed closer, the man's face pressed against the window now, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of shock and disbelief. He was mouthing something, maybe "go back" or "save yourself," but Maya couldn't tell and wouldn't have listened anyway. She reached the vehicle just as another surge of water slammed against it, nearly crushing her between the car and the bridge pillar. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she grabbed onto the door handle, using it to anchor herself against the current. The water inside the car was up to the man's neck now, maybe minutes from covering his head completely. His window was cracked open just an inch, probably his desperate attempt to let air in, but it wasn't enough to escape through. Maya's fingers, already numb from the cold, fumbled with the door handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. She pounded on the window, gesturing frantically for him to unlock it. But the man seemed frozen in terror, his eyes glazed with the particular look of someone who'd already accepted death. Maya wouldn't accept it. Couldn't accept it. She looked around desperately and spotted a loose chunk of concrete that had broken off the bridge pillar, bobbing in the debris-filled water. It took all her strength to grab it, lift it, and smash it against the window. Once, twice. On the third hit, the glass spider-webbed, and on the fourth, it shattered inward. Water immediately began pouring into the car even faster, and for a terrible moment, Maya thought she'd just killed him. But the inrushing water also equalized the pressure, and suddenly the door could open. She grabbed the man's arm. His expensive suit jacket was heavy with water, and surprisingly difficult to grip, and pulled with everything she had. Richard Donovan was a big man, probably 6 feet tall and well-built, and Maya was a skinny 13-year-old girl who barely cleared 5 feet. Under normal circumstances, she couldn't have moved him an inch. But adrenaline and desperation make people capable of impossible things. She wrapped her arms around his chest from behind and kicked away from the car, letting the current do half the work as she angled them toward the riverbank. The man coughed and sputtered, his weight threatening to drag them both under. Maya's muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned for air, and the cold had turned her limbs to lead. But she kept kicking, kept pulling, kept fighting the water that wanted to claim them both. She could see people running along the shore now, some wading into the shallower edges of the flood with ropes and reaching hands. Almost there, Maya gasped, though she didn't know if she was talking to the man or to herself. "Just hold on. Just hold on." Her foot finally scraped against something solid, the submerged remains of someone's fence maybe, or a fallen tree. She used it to push off, giving them one last surge towards safety. Hands grabbed her arms, her shoulders, pulling both her and Richard Donovan out of the water and onto the muddy hillside. Maya collapsed immediately, her body shaking so violently she couldn't have stood if she'd wanted to. She lay there in the mud, coughing up river water, her vision blurry and her ears ringing. Voices swirled around her, her grandfather's panicked prayers in Spanish, someone else calling for blankets, another person saying the ambulance was still 10 minutes away because the main roads were flooded, and then another voice, hoarse and weak but overwhelmed with emotion, cut through the chaos. "You saved my life." Richard Donovan was on his hands and knees beside her, river water and possibly tears streaming down his face. "You're just a child and everyone was just watching and you—" His voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence. Maya turned her head to look at him, this man her entire community hated, this person who'd caused so much pain and displacement, and all she could see was a human being who'd been terrified and alone, waiting to die while people celebrated. She thought about how that must have felt, to see your last moments reflected in the eyes of people who wanted you gone. Something about it seemed so unbearably sad that despite her exhaustion, despite everything, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't going to let you die." Vicente Rodriguez finally pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside his granddaughter. His weathered face was a storm of emotions, relief, fear, pride, anger. "Mija, you could have died. You could have," but he couldn't finish either. He just pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, his body shaking with the weight of what had almost happened. The crowd had gone silent now. The bitter satisfaction had drained from their faces, replaced by something more complicated, shame maybe, or confusion, or the uncomfortable realization that they'd been ready to let someone die over property disputes and hurt feelings. They looked at this skinny girl covered in mud and river water, and then at the millionaire businessman who'd been their enemy just minutes ago, and nobody quite knew what to say or do next. Richard Donovan sat there in the mud, his expensive suit ruined, his carefully constructed world shaken to its foundation. He looked at the girl who'd saved him, and at the old man who held her, and something inside him, something that had maybe been dormant for years, stirred awake. These were people he'd viewed as obstacles, as collateral damage in his business plans, but this child had risked everything for him when he'd given her community nothing but threats and pain. "Sir," Richard said, his voice steadier now as he addressed Vicente. "You're home. It's safe. I won't touch it. I won't touch any of this community. I swear to you." Vicente looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes that had seen too many empty promises in his 70 years. "Words are cheap when you're grateful to be breathing, Mr. Donovan. Let's see what you remember when you're dry and comfortable again." It was a fair point, and Richard couldn't argue with it. So instead he just nodded, understanding that trust wasn't something you earned with promises. It was something you built with actions over time, through choices that cost you something real. The ambulance finally arrived, its lights flashing red and blue against the grey afternoon. Paramedics rushed over with blankets and medical equipment, checking Maya and Richard for hypothermia and injuries. Maya's shoulder was badly bruised where she'd been slammed against the bridge, and her body temperature had dropped dangerously low. They wanted to take both of them to the hospital immediately, but as they prepared to load Maya into the ambulance, Richard caught Vicente's arm. "Please," he said, and there was something in his voice, something raw and genuine that hadn't been there before. "When she's cleared by the doctors, when you're sure she's safe, could I come by? Could I? I'd like to thank her properly. Both of you." Vicente studied the man's face for a long moment, looking for the calculated business move, the angle, the self-interest. But all he saw was genuine humility and something that looked like transformation beginning to take root. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that told him this man couldn't be trusted, Vicente nodded once. "Tomorrow evening," he said gruffly, 6 o'clock. "And don't bring your lawyers or your checkbook. Just yourself." Richard nodded, understanding the terms. No business. No transactions. Just human beings acknowledging what had passed between them in the floodwaters and what it meant. As the ambulance pulled away with Maya inside, Richard Donovan stood there in the mud, watching it go. He was shivering now, the adrenaline wearing off and the cold settling deep into his bones. But he barely noticed. All he could think about was the moment he'd seen that small figure diving into the water, swimming toward him while everyone else watched with satisfaction. He'd looked into her eyes through the broken window and seen something he'd forgotten existed. Uncomplicated goodness. Selfless courage. The kind of humanity that didn't calculate cost or benefit before acting. It had been a very long time since Richard Donovan had encountered anything pure. And standing there in the aftermath, soaked and humbled and alive against all odds, he realized he barely recognized the man he'd become. The question was, could he find his way back to something better? Could one moment of grace be enough to crack open a heart that had slowly calcified over years of ruthless ambition? He didn't know the answer yet. But tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock, he'd show up at a small house in Meadowbrook with nothing but gratitude and a willingness to be changed. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start something new. The next evening arrived with the kind of golden light that only October in Tennessee could produce. The flood had receded almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind mud, debris, and memories that would take much longer to wash away. Maya sat on her grandfather's porch, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite the mild temperature. The doctors had cleared her miraculously. She'd escaped with nothing more than a badly bruised shoulder and some scratches, but Vicente insisted she rest. And when her abuelo insisted on something, you didn't argue. She watched the sun sink lower over the river, painting the water in shades of amber and rose, and tried not to think about the cold, the current, the moment when she'd thought maybe they'd both go under. Instead, she focused on the hummingbird feeder hanging from the porch beam, watching the tiny creatures dart back and forth in their eternal, frantic dance. "He'll come," Vicente said from his rocking chair, though Maya hadn't spoken her doubt aloud. Her grandfather had always had that ability, to hear the questions she didn't ask. Men like that, when they make a promise after facing death, they keep it, at least for a while. "You don't trust him," Maya said. "It wasn't a question." "I don't trust what he was," Vicente corrected, his weathered hands folded over his chest. "But maybe what he is now, that's still being written. We'll see." At precisely 6 o'clock, a car pulled up to their small house, not the Mercedes that had nearly become Richard Donovan's tomb, but a much more modest rental sedan. The man who stepped out looked different from the terrified figure Maya had pulled from the water. He'd cleaned up naturally, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of an expensive suit. But it was more than that. He moved differently, carried himself differently, like someone who'd shed a weight they didn't even know they'd been carrying. Richard walked up the gravel path slowly, taking in the simple beauty of the property, the carefully tended vegetable garden, the hand-painted ceramic pots filled with flowers, the fishing nets hung up to dry on the side of the small boathouse. This was a home, Maya realized, watching him see it perhaps for the first time with actual eyes, instead of developers' calculations. Her real home with love and history and meaning. "Mr. Rodriguez," Richard said as he reached the porch steps, his voice respectful. "Thank you for allowing me to come." Vicente nodded once, stern but not unkind. "Come sit. We have fresh iced tea." Maya made it herself. They settled into an awkward arrangement, Richard in the spare rocking chair, Maya curled up on the porch swing, Vicente standing like a sentinel between them and the door. For a long moment nobody spoke. A mockingbird sang from the oak tree, and the river whispered its eternal song in the background. "I don't know how to do this," Richard finally said, breaking the silence. His hands gripped his knees, and Maya noticed they were shaking slightly. "I've negotiated million-dollar deals. I've spoken at conferences. I've stared down corporate rivals without blinking. But I don't know how to thank someone for giving me my life back." "You could start by explaining why you were on River Road during a flash flood warning," Vicente said bluntly. "That's not the route to the highway. That's local roads." "Why were you there?" Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maya thought he might deflect, give some polished excuse. But then his shoulders sagged. "I was being petty," he admitted, childish even. "The city council had just voted down my latest development proposal, the one that would have required relocating some of the families here in Meadowbrook. I was angry, driving around, looking at the properties, thinking about how to get around their decision. And then the water came so fast, You were planning how to take our homes, Vicente said flatly. Yes, Richard said, meeting the old man's eyes without flinching. I was. And then your granddaughter risked her life to save mine, even knowing that. So you tell me, Mr. Rodriguez, how does a man make that right? Vicente studied him for a long moment. You already made a promise yesterday about not touching this community. That's a start. It's more than a promise now, Richard said, pulling folded papers from his pocket. I had my lawyers draw this up today. It's a conservation easement. This entire stretch of riverfront, all 40 acres I own, will be protected. No development ever, it'll stay exactly as it is. He held out the papers, but Vicente didn't take them. Papers can be undone by other papers. Not these, Richard insisted. It's irrevocable. And I'm gifting the land to a trust that will maintain it for the community. You can have your lawyers look it over. It's real. Maya watched her grandfather's face soften slightly, though he still didn't smile. Then that's a good first step toward being a different man than you were. Richard nodded, seeming to understand that forgiveness would be earned slowly, if at all. He turned his attention to Maya then, and his expression transformed into something tender and awed. How are you feeling? Really? That is or, Maya admitted with a small smile, but okay. The doctor said I was lucky. No, Richard said quietly. I was lucky. You were brave. There's a difference. He paused, seeming to struggle with emotion. My daughter. She's about your age, 15, lives with her mother in Nashville. We barely speak anymore. And yesterday, in that car, when I thought I was going to die, all I could think was that I'd wasted so much time. So many years chasing money and success and proving something to people I don't even like. And for what? The vulnerability in his voice surprised Maya. This wasn't the cold businessman her community had described. This was just a person who'd looked into the face of death and found himself wanting. You can still fix things, Maya said simply. With your daughter, I mean. It's not too late. Richard smiled sadly. From your mouth to God's ears, kiddo. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small jeweler's box. I wanted to bring you something. Not as payment. You can't pay someone for saving your life. But as, I don't know, a symbol maybe. Maya opened the box carefully. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with small charms. A hummingbird, a river wave, a tiny book. It's beautiful, she breathed. The hummingbird for courage, Richard explained. The wave for surviving the flood. And the book because your grandfather told me you love reading. That you want to be a writer someday. Maya looked up surprised at her abuelo, who shrugged with the hint of a smile. We talked on the phone this afternoon, Vicente admitted. I wanted to make sure he was really coming alone, no lawyers like I said. As Richard helped Maya fasten the bracelet, his eyes caught on something else. The necklace Maya always wore. It was simple. Just a small silver pendant in the shape of a fish hanging on a thin chain that had seen better days. But something about it made Richard freeze, his face going pale. That necklace, he said, his voice strange and tight. Where did you get it? Maya touched it instinctively, protective. It was a gift. Why? From who? Richard's hands trembled as he leaned forward. Please, Maya, this is important. Who gave you that necklace? Maya exchanged a confused glance with her grandfather before answering. A boy, I was 7, so 6 years ago. He was here fishing with some woman. I don't remember much about her. But he was really nice. Blonde hair, kind of quiet. We played together for just one afternoon, building sandcastles down by the calm part of the river. And when they were leaving, he took off this necklace and gave it to me. Said he wanted me to have it so I'd remember him. Richard's breath came faster now, his composure cracking. Did he tell you his name? Lucas, Maya said. He said his name was Lucas. The sound that came from Richard Donovan was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. He stood up so abruptly that his chair rocked violently, and for a moment Maya thought he might collapse. Vicente moved quickly to steady him, decades of helping injured fishermen giving him sure hands. Mr. Donovan? Vicente said sharply. What's wrong? Richard couldn't speak. He fumbled with his wallet, fingers shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Finally, he pulled out a worn photograph and thrust it toward Maya with desperate hands. Is this him? Is this the boy? Maya took the photo carefully. It showed a younger Richard Donovan, smiling genuinely with his arm around a little boy of maybe 5 or 6. The child had blonde hair, blue eyes, and was holding up a fish he'd caught, grinning with pride. And around his neck, clearly visible in the photograph, was a silver chain with a small fish pendant. That's him, Maya whispered. That's Lucas. He's older in the picture, but that's definitely him. Who is he? My son, Richard said, and now tears were streaming openly down his face. My son, Lucas Donovan. He disappeared 6 years ago, just vanished. We were at my ex-wife's sister's house, a big family gathering. He was playing in the yard one moment, and then he was gone. We searched everywhere. Police, private investigators, FBI, nothing. No trace. No leads. It was like he'd never existed, except we knew he had, because the hole he left behind was so big it swallowed everything else in my life. The porch went silent except for the sound of Richard's ragged breathing and the eternal song of the river. Maya looked down at the necklace she'd worn for 6 years, a simple gift from a lonely boy that had now become the first thread in a mystery that had haunted a father through endless nights. You're saying, Vicente said slowly, carefully, that your son was here 6 years ago, in Meadowbrook. I'm saying he was alive, Richard corrected, his voice breaking. 6 months after he disappeared, he was alive and well enough to be playing with Maya, which means he couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the hope and horror warring in his chest, which means someone took him, Vicente finished grimly, and kept him, and maybe still has him. Maya's hand closed around the fish pendant, her mind racing back to that day 6 years ago. She'd been so young, her memories were fragmented and soft-edged, but she tried to focus, to pull details from the blur of time. The woman, she said suddenly, the one he was with, she kept calling him sweetie and baby, but not like a mother. More like someone playing a role, Richard supplied, his voice hard now, anger mixing with the grief. What did she look like? I don't know, Maya said, frustrated. I was 7. I barely paid attention to adults. I just remember she had dark hair and sunglasses, and she seemed nervous. She kept looking around like she was worried about something. Richard pulled out his phone with shaking hands and scrolled through photos. This woman, he said, showing them a picture of an elegant brunette in her 40s. Her name is Patricia Hartwell. She was my ex-wife's best friend, my son's godmother. She's the one who was supposed to be watching Lucas at the party when he disappeared. She claimed she'd only looked away for a minute. Vicente and Maya studied the photo, but neither could say for certain. 6 years was a long time, and a glimpse of a nervous woman in sunglasses wasn't much to build an identification on. There's more, Richard said, sitting back down heavily, his earlier composure completely shattered. After Lucas disappeared, Patricia became very involved, helping coordinate search efforts, organizing vigils, supporting my ex-wife. And then, about 2 years ago, she inherited money from a distant relative. A lot of money. Enough to move from a modest apartment to a house in an expensive suburb. You think she took your son, Vicente said. It wasn't a question. I think, Richard said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone trying not to let hope destroy them, that Patricia was always jealous of what my family had. She never married, never had children, and she was named in my will as Lucas's guardian if something happened to both me and his mother. If Lucas was gone, and then something happened to us, she'd have control of the trust fund set up for him. $20 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt sick, understanding for the first time the kind of evil that could make someone steal a child, keep him from his family, raise him as a prisoner for money. But why give him that necklace? Maya asked. Why let him play with me? Why risk someone seeing him? Because he was a real boy, Vicente said quietly, his old eyes sad with understanding. A child, not a possession. And children need other children. Need to play, need to have something normal even in abnormal circumstances. She probably thought a small town hours away from Nashville was safe enough, that no one would recognize him or connect him to the missing Donovan boy from the news. Richard stood again, pacing now with renewed energy. I have to find him. If he was alive 6 years ago, he might still be alive now. He'd be 15, almost 16. My God, I've missed his entire childhood. You need to be careful, Vicente warned. If this woman did take him, and she thinks you're getting close to the truth, she might... He didn't finish, but everyone understood. Might run, might hide Lucas even more carefully, might do something worse. I don't care about careful, Richard said fiercely. That's my son. Then don't care about careful, Vicente replied with equal intensity. But be smart. You go charging in with police and accusations, and you'll spook her. Or worse, you'll discover you're wrong and destroy an innocent woman's life because you're desperate." Richard stopped pacing, his hands clenched into fists. "So what do I do?" Maya spoke up then, her voice small but certain. "We investigate quietly, the three of us. We find out if it's really him before we bring in anyone else. Because Mr. Rodriguez is right. If we're wrong, it's terrible. But if we're right and we mess this up, you might lose the only chance you have to get your son back." Richard looked at this 13-year-old girl, who'd already saved his life once, and was now offering to help save it again in a completely different way. "Why would you do this, either of you? You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you everything." "Because that boy gave me his necklace when he had nothing else to give," Maya said simply. "And because somewhere out there, maybe he's scared and alone and thinks nobody's looking for him anymore. And that's not okay." Vicente nodded slowly, his decision made. Plus, if this woman did steal a child and has been living comfortable on blood money for 6 years, someone needs to make that right. Might as well be us. Richard Donovan, the millionaire businessman who'd spent years thinking of people as obstacles or assets, felt something crack open in his chest. These people, this family he'd threatened to displace, this girl he'd have destroyed without a second thought, they were offering him something no amount of money could buy. They were offering him hope and help and humanity. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Maya said, touching her new bracelet. "Now let's go find Lucas." As the three of them sat on that porch making plans and sharing theories, while the Tennessee sun set over the river, something new was beginning. Not just a search for a lost boy, but a bond forged between people who should have been enemies. The businessman and the fisherman, the millionaire and the girl with nothing but courage. 3 people brought together by floodwaters and a silver fish necklace, united now in a mission that mattered more than money or property or pride. Somewhere out there, a teenage boy was living a life he might not even know was stolen. And whether he remembered who he'd once been or not, he was about to be found. The river whispered its approval, flowing endlessly toward whatever came next. 2 weeks of careful investigation had led them here, to Clearwater Beach, a small coastal town in South Carolina, about 300 miles from Riverside Falls. Richard had hired a discreet private investigator, someone with no connection to his previous searches, and the trail had pointed unmistakably toward Patricia Hartwell's vacation home. Except it wasn't really a vacation home at all. Property records showed she'd been paying utilities there year-round for the past 5 years, and neighbors reported seeing a teenage boy who lived there, but rarely left the property. The 3 unlikely partners sat in Richard's rental car, parked across from a modest beach house, painted pale yellow with white shutters. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful and innocent, the kind of home that gave no hint of the secrets it might hold inside. "That's him," Richard breathed, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "That's my son." Through the large front window, they could see a teenage boy sitting at a table bent over what looked like homework. He had grown taller, his features sharper and more defined by adolescence, but the blonde hair and the shape of his face were unmistakable. Even from this distance, even through glass and 6 years of stolen time, Richard knew his child. "You can't just run in there," Vicente warned, placing a steady hand on Richard's arm. "We talked about this. We have to be smart." "That's my boy," Richard said, his voice breaking. "He's right there. After 6 years of searching, of hoping, of nightmares, he's right there and I'm supposed to just sit here." "Yes," Maya said firmly from the back seat, "because if you scare him, if you overwhelm him, if Patricia convinces him you're the danger, we could lose him again. Maybe forever this time." Richard closed his eyes, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to kick down that door and take back what had been stolen. But he knew they were right. The boy in that window might not remember being Lucas Donovan. He might not remember his father at all. 6 years was an eternity in a child's life. Half of his existence had been spent living as someone else, believing whatever lies Patricia had told him. "So what do we do?" Richard asked. And there was something heartbreaking about hearing this powerful man defer to a 13-year-old girl and an elderly fisherman. "We make contact carefully," Vicente said. "We watch, we learn his routine, and then we find a natural way to meet him. No confrontation. No drama, just connection. They spent 3 days observing from a distance. They learned that the boy, Patricia called him Ethan, they discovered by listening carefully during her brief trips to the mailbox, had a restricted life. He was homeschooled, rarely left the property, and seemed to have no friends his age. Twice a week, Patricia drove him to a small library in town where he'd spend exactly 1 hour browsing books before she'd collect him again. Always watching him through the window like a warden monitoring an inmate. "He's a prisoner," Maya whispered on the 3rd day as they watched this routine play out. "He doesn't even know he's a prisoner, but he is." The library visits became their opportunity. On the 4th day, they put their plan into action. Vicente would stay with the car, ready to intervene if things went wrong. Richard would wait outside, unable to trust himself to stay calm in close proximity to his son, and Maya, small, non-threatening, age-appropriate Maya, would make first contact. She found him in the history section, running his fingers along the spines of books about World War II. Up close, Maya could see the family resemblance even more clearly. He had Richard's eyes, the same shade of blue-gray, and the same slight dimple in his left cheek when he concentrated. "That one's really good," Maya said casually, pointing to a biography of Eisenhower. "If you like military history." The boy, Lucas Ethan, whoever he believed he was, looked up startled. Then a small, uncertain smile crossed his face. "You've read it?" "My grandfather was in the army," Maya said, sticking close to the truth. "He likes telling me stories about history. Says we need to learn from the past so we don't repeat the same mistakes." That's a really cool way to think about it," the boy said, and Maya's heart broke a little at how hungry he seemed for normal teenage conversation. "I mostly read alone." "Homeschooled," he added with a slight grimace. "That must be lonely sometimes," Maya offered carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. Then, as if remembering caution, he glanced toward the window where Patricia's car was visible. "But it's fine. My aunt, she takes good care of me." Aunt, not mother. That was something, at least. "I'm Maya," she said, extending her hand. He shook it with a politeness that seemed old-fashioned for a teenager. Ethan, Harper." The last name came a beat too late, and Maya caught the hesitation. They talked for 20 minutes, carefully casual before Patricia appeared in the doorway, her posture immediately tense when she saw her ward talking to a stranger. Maya recognized her now from Richard's photos, though she'd aged and worry had carved lines into her face. "Ethan," Patricia said sharply. "Time to go." "Already?" The boy looked disappointed. "Can we come back tomorrow?" "I haven't finished." "We'll see," Patricia said, her eyes never leaving Maya's face. "Say goodbye." As they left, the boy, Lucas, gave Maya an apologetic smile and a small wave. And Patricia looked back once, her expression a mix of suspicion and fear that confirmed everything they'd suspected. In the car, Maya reported every detail while Richard sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by finally being so close yet still impossibly far from his son. "He doesn't remember," Richard said hollowly. He called her his aunt. "He uses a different name. 6 years and she's erased me completely." "Maybe not completely," Vicente said thoughtfully. "Did you notice the necklace?" Maya shook her head. "He wasn't wearing one." "Exactly," Vicente said. "If she'd really made him forget everything, made him into a completely different person, why would the necklace matter?" But she took it away, which means some part of him still held on to that memory, even if he doesn't fully understand it. She had to remove physical reminders because psychological control wasn't quite enough. It was a small hope, but Richard clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. Over the next week, Maya accidentally ran into Lucas 3 more times at the library. Each meeting was carefully planned to seem casual, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, but executed with the natural ease of teenage friendship. She learned that he loved reading, that he was teaching himself piano using YouTube videos, that he had vague, unsettling dreams sometimes about a big house and a woman with kind eyes who sang him lullabies in Spanish. "My mother used to sing to me," Lucas told Maya during their 4th meeting, his voice distant. "At least I think she did, or maybe I saw it in a movie. Sometimes I can't tell what's real memory and what I've just imagined." "What does your aunt say when you ask her?" Maya asked carefully. Lucas looked down at his hands. "She says my parents died when I was young, car accident, and that I was so traumatized that my brain blocked out most of my early childhood. She says that's normal, that I shouldn't try to force the memories or I might hurt myself psychologically. It was a clever lie, Maya thought. Close enough to truth to explain his confusion. Convenient enough to keep him from searching for answers. But sometimes, Lucas continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, I don't think that's right. Sometimes I remember things that don't fit her story, like, I remember fishing on a river, not an ocean. And I remember someone, a man, teaching me how to cast a line, how to be patient. He had this laugh that was really loud and made everyone around him smile. His eyes met Maya's, and there was such confusion and pain in them. But Aunt Patricia says we've always lived near the ocean. That I never went fishing on a river, so why do I remember it? Maya had to look away before her own tears betrayed her. She knew exactly who that man was. She'd seen Richard laugh just once in their weeks together, when Vicente had told a terrible joke about a fish and a lawyer. It was loud and genuine, and made his whole face transform. Maybe, Maya said carefully, your brain is trying to tell you something. Maybe those memories are real, and the story you've been told is what's not quite right. Lucas looked at her sharply, something flickering behind his eyes. Hope or fear? She couldn't tell. Why would she lie to me? It was the question that could crack everything open or slam every door shut. Maya chose her words like she was diffusing a bomb. I don't know if she is lying, Maya said. But if you feel like something's wrong, like pieces don't fit, maybe you should trust that feeling. Our instincts usually know things before our minds catch up. Before Lucas could respond, Patricia appeared again earlier than usual, her face tight with barely controlled anger. Ethan, now. This time there was no pretense of politeness. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door, and Maya saw Lucas wince at the grip. As they passed, Patricia leaned close to Maya, her voice low and threatening. I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, but stay away from my nephew. If I see you talking to him again, I'll call the police. For what? Maya asked, keeping her voice innocent. Making a friend? Patricia's face twisted into something ugly. He doesn't need friends, he has me. That's enough. And then they were gone, Patricia practically dragging Lucas to the car. But before they got in, Lucas looked back once and his expression was no longer confused. It was questioning, searching, awakening. That night, the three investigators sat in Vicente's hotel room, planning their next move. The time for careful approach was ending. Patricia was spooked, and spooked people did desperate things. We need proof, Richard said, pacing the small room. Concrete proof before we involve the authorities. DNA, birth certificate, something that proves he's Lucas Donovan beyond any doubt. How do we get his DNA without alerting Patricia? Vicente asked practically. The library, Maya said suddenly. He always gets a drink at the water fountain. We could get a paper cup or bottle he's used. Richard nodded slowly. That could work, but we need more than DNA. We need to understand how she did this, how she's kept him hidden for 6 years without anyone questioning it. The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching Patricia's background, the private investigator Richard had hired discovered something interesting. She'd been a child psychologist before retiring 7 years ago. She'd specialized in trauma therapy and memory recovery, which meant she knew exactly how to manipulate a traumatized child's mind, how to reshape memories, how to convince a young boy that his entire history was different from the truth. She didn't just steal him, Richard said, his voice shaking with rage. She brainwashed him, professionally, methodically. She used her training to make him forget us, forget himself. They also found financial records that told a damning story. Large cash withdrawals every month, purchases of medical equipment used in psychiatric practice, and most damning, correspondence with a corrupt doctor who'd provided false medical records documenting Ethan Harper's traumatic childhood and ongoing psychological treatment. All of it pointed to a carefully constructed lie, maintained over years through manipulation and illegal documentation. But the smoking gun came 3 days later, when their private investigator discovered an old storage unit rented under Patricia's maiden name. Inside were boxes of Lucas's childhood belongings, toys, clothes, photos, his original birth certificate, everything that could prove his real identity, hidden away like evidence of a crime, which, of course it was. We have enough, Richard said, staring at the photographs of his son as a small child. Images he'd thought he'd lost forever. We have proof. We can go to the police now. And what happens to Lucas? Vicente asked quietly. Police, lawyers, courts, chaos? He gets ripped away from the only life he's known for 6 years. A false life, yes, but still the only reality he understands. That's traumatic all over again. So what do you suggest? Richard asked, not angry but genuinely wanting guidance. We tell him the truth first, Maya said. Before the police, before everything explodes, we give him the chance to understand what happened to him, to choose to come home rather than being taken. He deserves that much. Richard looked at these two people who'd become his unlikely allies, his unexpected family. And how do we do that? Maya smiled, an idea forming. We let him figure it out himself, with just a little push in the right direction. The next day, Maya returned to the library despite Patricia's threats. This time, she carried something carefully hidden in her backpack, a manila envelope containing copies of everything they'd found. Birth certificate, childhood photos of Lucas with his real family, newspaper articles about his disappearance, and a letter from Richard, written and rewritten dozens of times, explaining everything with the desperate love of a father who'd never stopped searching. She found Lucas in their usual spot, and he looked relieved to see her. I'm not supposed to talk to you, he said immediately. Aunt Patricia said, I know what she said, Maya interrupted gently, and I know you probably think you should listen to her. But I need you to do something for me, something important. She pulled out the envelope and set it on the table between them, his eyes fixed on it immediately, drawn to it like gravity. What is that? Answers, Maya said simply, to questions you've been asking yourself your whole life, about who you are, where you came from, why your memories don't match the story you've been told. Lucas's hand hovered over the envelope, trembling slightly. How do you know about my memories? Because the man who taught you to fish, who had the loud laugh, who you remember even though you're not supposed to. Maya's voice broke. He's real. He's been looking for you for 6 years. And he's never stopped loving you, not for a single day. Tears spilled down Lucas's face before he could stop them. I don't understand. Open it, Maya urged. Read it, look at the pictures, and then decide for yourself what's true. You deserve to know. You deserve to choose. Lucas's hands shook as he opened the envelope and pulled out the contents. Maya watched his face as he read, as he looked at pictures of a small blonde boy who looked just like him being held by a man with that unforgettable laugh. She saw the moment recognition crash through years of careful conditioning, saw the moment his real memories, buried but never truly dead, rose to the surface. This is me, he whispered, holding up a photo of 5-year-old Lucas at a birthday party, wearing a crown and covered in cake. I remember this. I remember the taste of that cake, chocolate with raspberry filling. I remember being so happy. You were stolen, Maya said gently, by someone who was supposed to love you and protect you. But you weren't forgotten, and now you have a choice. Keep living the lie or reclaim your truth. Lucas looked up at her, his face awash with tears and confusion and dawning understanding. My father. He's alive. He's been looking for me. He's in the parking lot right now, Maya said. He's been here every day, waiting for you to be ready. He didn't want to scare you or force you. He wanted you to know the truth first. For a long moment, Lucas just sat there, trembling, holding pieces of his stolen childhood in his shaking hands. And then, with the kind of courage that runs in families, he stood up. I want to see him, Lucas said, his voice cracking but certain. I want to see my father. And as Maya led him through the library doors and into the parking lot, where Richard Donovan waited with a breaking heart and desperate hope, she thought about how sometimes justice isn't about courts and laws. Sometimes it's about truth coming to light and families finding their way back to each other, no matter how much time or darkness has come between them. The reunion would be messy, emotional, complicated. There would be police and lawyers and trials ahead. Patricia would be arrested. There would be therapy and healing and years of rebuilding trust. But in that moment, when Lucas took his first uncertain steps toward the father he'd been forced to forget, and Richard opened his arms to the son he'd never stopped mourning, something essential and right clicked back into place in the universe. And Maya, watching from a distance with Vicente's steady hand on her shoulder, knew that diving into those floodwaters weeks ago had saved more than just a life. It had saved a family, restored a truth, proved that compassion and courage could triumph over greed and cruelty. The river in Riverside Falls had given Richard Donovan back his breath. But that silverfish necklace and the brave girl who wore it had given him back his soul. The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. With the mountain of evidence Richard's team had gathered, the storage unit full of Lucas's belongings, the falsified medical records, financial trails showing Patricia's embezzlement from the trust fund, and most damning of all, testimony from the corrupt doctor who'd helped her maintain the deception, Patricia Hartwell's carefully constructed lies crumbled like a sandcastle against the tide. She was arrested 3 hours after Lucas walked away from her for the last time. The charges read like something from a crime thriller: kidnapping, fraud, child endangerment, identity falsification, and embezzlement. The judge denied bail after prosecutors argued she was a flight risk. Patricia, who'd spent 6 years playing the role of devoted aunt, finally showed her true face in that courtroom. Not remorseful, not apologetic, but coldly furious that her plan had failed. "He was happy with me," she'd hissed at Richard during one court appearance. Her mask completely dropped. "I gave him stability, structure, a good home. What did you give him? A father too busy building empires to notice his own son? He was better off with me." Richard hadn't responded. He'd simply taken Lucas's hand. His son had asked to be called both Lucas and Ethan now, refusing to erase either part of his identity, and walked away. Some arguments weren't worth having, especially with people who'd twisted love into possession and called it justified. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the real work that came after. Rebuilding a relationship that had been violently severed and carefully suppressed wasn't something that happened in courtrooms. It happened in therapy sessions, in quiet conversations, in small moments of trust slowly reconstructed. Lucas moved into his father's home in Nashville, a beautiful house that he remembered in fragments, like pieces of a dream half forgotten upon waking. His bedroom was exactly as he'd left it 6 years ago, preserved like a shrine to a missing child. Richard had changed nothing, unable to let go even when hope seemed impossible. "I used to come in here," Richard admitted on Lucas's first night. Home, standing in the doorway of the room filled with toys for a 9-year-old boy. "Every single night for years, I'd sit on your bed and just talk to you, tell you about my day, tell you I was still looking, that I'd never stop." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." Lucas, sitting on that bed now as a 15-year-old who'd lived an entire other life, looked at his father with eyes that held both his child self and the teenager he'd become. "You found me eventually, that's what matters." But finding was different from knowing, and knowing was different from remembering. Lucas's memories were a complicated tangle, real moments from his childhood with Richard, carefully implanted, false memories from Patricia, and genuine experiences from the 6 years he'd lived as Ethan Harper. Therapy helped him sort through what was real and what was manufactured, but it was slow, painful work. Some days were good. Lucas would remember something genuine, the way his father used to make pancakes in funny shapes, or the bedtime story, routine they'd had, or the feel of being carried on his father's shoulders through the Nashville Zoo, and it would feel like coming home after a long journey. Those were the days when Richard would see his little boy flash through the teenager's features, when they'd laugh together over old inside jokes Lucas hadn't known he'd remembered. Other days were hard. Lucas would wake up calling for Aunt Patricia, then feel sick with guilt and confusion when he realized what he'd done. Or he'd flinch away from affection, his body remembering 6 years of emotional manipulation that had taught him love came with conditions and control. Those were the days when Richard would lie awake at night, fighting the rage at what had been done to his son and the helplessness of not being able to fix it instantly. Maya and Vicente became unexpected constants in this healing process. They visited often, making the long drive from Tennessee to Nashville every few weeks. Maya had become the bridge between Lucas's 2 lives, young enough to understand the confusion of adolescence, but removed enough from his trauma to feel safe. With her, he could talk about the strange experience of having 2 names, 2 histories, 2 incomplete versions of himself. "Does it get easier?" Lucas asked her one afternoon. They were sitting on the dock behind Richard's house, their feet dangling over the water. Feeling like yourself? I don't know, Maya admitted honestly. I've only ever been one person, but I think maybe you're not supposed to choose between Lucas and Ethan. Maybe you're supposed to be both. The boy you were and the person you became, and whoever you're going to be next. All of it is you. Lucas looked at the silver fish necklace she still wore, the one he'd given her 6 years ago, the thread that had led them all back to each other. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't saved my dad that day? If you just let him drown like everyone else wanted? All the time, Maya said softly. But then I remember what my abuelo always tells me. We don't save people because they deserve it, or because we'll get something from it. We save people because that's what makes us human. The choice to care, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense. That's the choice that matters. Vicente, sitting in a chair nearby with a fishing pole and an endless patience, nodded his approval. Smart girl, that one, he said to Richard, who'd joined them on the dock. You could learn a thing or two from her. I already have, Richard said quietly. And it was true. The man who'd almost drowned in that flood wasn't the same man who'd emerged from it. Richard Donovan had spent his entire adult life believing success was measured in money, property, and power. He'd built an empire while his family crumbled. He'd threatened communities to expand his wealth. He'd become the kind of person others celebrated seeing suffer, but nearly dying, and then finding his son through an act of selfless courage from someone he'd tried to harm, had cracked open something inside him that money had sealed shut. He'd started seeing people as people again, not as obstacles or assets, and once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. True to his word, Richard had permanently protected the Meadowbrook community from development, but he'd gone further. He'd established a foundation focused on affordable housing, hiring architects to design beautiful, sustainable homes for working families. He'd partnered with local communities instead of bulldozing them. He'd used his wealth and influence to lift people up rather than push them aside. Redemption projects, one of his business partners had called them dismissively. Good for PR, but bad for profit margins. I'm not trying to redeem myself, Richard had replied calmly. I'm trying to be someone my son can be proud of. That's worth more than any profit margin. Lucas was proud, though he was still learning how to show it. 15 years old and carrying 6 years of trauma meant emotions were complicated, trust was fragile, and healing wasn't linear. Some days he'd hug his father spontaneously, and Richard would hold on perhaps too tight, treasuring the voluntary affection. Other days Lucas needed space, needed to process, needed to be alone with the confusing tangle of his memories and identity. His relationship with his mother was even more complicated. She'd remarried during the years Lucas was missing, had another child, had built a new life around the grief of losing her son. When he returned, it was joyful and painful in equal measure. She wanted her little boy back, but that little boy no longer existed. In his place was a teenager who barely remembered her, who had to be reintroduced to a half-sibling he'd never known, who had to figure out where he fit in a family that had learned to exist without him. But they were trying, all of them. Family therapy, individual therapy, patience, and the understanding that healing wasn't about returning to what was. It was about building something new from the broken pieces. 6 months after Lucas came home, Richard organized a gathering at his Nashville house. He invited Maya and Vicente, Lucas's mother and her family, old friends who'd supported the search, and the community from Riverside Falls who'd learned that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond it. It was Maya who suggested they gather by the river. Richard's property had a beautiful stretch of the Cumberland running through it, and it seemed appropriate somehow. Water had nearly taken Richard's life, but it had also brought them all together. The river was witness to everything that had changed. As the sun set golden over the water and fireflies began their evening dance, Richard stood before the gathered crowd with Lucas beside him. His son looked nervous but determined, his hand occasionally touching the silver fish necklace that he'd reclaimed and now wore again. 6 months ago, Richard began, his voice carrying over the gentle sound of the river. I was drowning, not just in that flood, but in life. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone cruel, someone selfish, someone who measured worth in dollars and saw people as obstacles to profit. I was drowning in my own success, and I didn't even know it. He looked at Maya, who stood between Vicente and her grandfather, looking uncomfortable with the attention, but steady in her conviction. And then a 13-year-old girl who had every reason to hate me, whose community I'd threatened, whose home I'd tried to destroy. She dove into the water and pulled me out. She saved my life when no one else would, when I didn't deserve it. But she didn't just save my life, Richard continued, his voice thickening with emotion. She saved my soul. She saved my family. Because if Maya hadn't saved me that day, I wouldn't have been sitting on Vicente's porch. I wouldn't have seen the necklace. I wouldn't have found my son. Lucas stepped forward then, his voice less steady than his father's, but no less sincere. I lost 6 years of my life to someone who claimed to love me, but really just wanted to own me. 6 years of memories of childhood, of knowing who I was. And I'm still figuring out how to be okay with that. How to forgive myself for not remembering sooner, for not fighting harder, for not knowing something was wrong. He touched the fish necklace again, and Maya smiled at him encouragingly. But I also know that on one day 6 years ago, I gave this necklace to a girl I barely knew, because something inside me wanted to leave a piece of myself behind, a piece that belonged to Lucas Donovan, not Ethan Harper. And maybe somehow I knew. Maybe I knew I needed to leave a trail of breadcrumbs to find my way home. I did find my way home, Lucas said, looking at his father, then at Maya and Vicente, then at all the faces gathered around them. Because people cared enough to look, because a girl was brave enough to save a stranger. Because my dad never gave up. Because there are people in this world who choose compassion over bitterness, love over hate, courage over comfort. Vicente stood then, his weathered hands gripping his hat. I want to say something, if I may. Everyone turned to the old fisherman, whose quiet dignity commanded respect. I've lived 7 decades on this earth, and I've learned that the river doesn't care about your bank account. The flood doesn't check your credit score before it rises. When you're drowning, money means nothing. Power means nothing. All that matters is whether someone will reach out their hand and pull you to safety. He looked at Richard, then at Lucas, then at his granddaughter. My Maya, she knows this in her bones. She didn't save Mr. Donovan because he deserved it, or because she thought she'd get something from it. She saved him because that's what you do when someone is drowning. You save them, and maybe in saving them, you save a part of yourself too. The crowd was silent, the truth of his words settling over them like evening mist over water. Then Maya spoke, her voice small but clear in the gathering darkness. I just want to say that I didn't do anything special. I didn't do anything heroic. I just couldn't watch someone die, that's all. I couldn't stand there and do nothing. She looked around at all these faces, people who'd hated Richard Donovan, people who'd wanted him to suffer, people who'd learned that their bitterness had been eating them alive just as much as his greed had consumed him. Maybe that's the real lesson, Maya continued, that we all have a choice every single day about what kind of people we want to be. Do we let our hurt make us cruel? Do we let our anger make us cold? Do we watch people drown because we think they deserve it? Or do we choose to be better than our pain? To be bigger than our bitterness? To save people even when they don't deserve it, because maybe saving them is what makes us deserve the lives we have. In the silence that followed, there wasn't a dry eye among them. Even the hardest hearts in that crowd had been softened by the truth of what they'd witnessed. Not just a rescue from drowning, but a rescue from the kind of spiritual death that comes from letting hate win. As the evening wore on and people mingled, sharing food and stories and tentative new friendships, Richard found himself standing at the water's edge with the 4 people who mattered most. Lucas, Maya, Vicente, and his ex-wife Sarah, who'd been gracious enough to put aside their complicated history for their son's sake. I spent years building things, Richard said quietly, watching the river flow past. Buildings, businesses, bank accounts. I thought that's what mattered. I thought that's what would make me important, make me matter, make me somebody. He looked at Lucas, who leaned against him comfortably now, still learning to accept affection, but learning. But none of that brought you home. None of that mattered when I was drowning. The only thing that saved me, the only thing that saved us, was other people choosing to care. So what now? Sarah asked gently. What do you build next? Richard smiled, and it was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that had been absent for too many years. Something better. Something that matters. A life where people don't celebrate when I'm drowning. A family that knows love isn't about control or possession. A legacy that my son can actually be proud of instead of ashamed. Lucas looked up at him, those blue-gray eyes so like his father's. I'm already proud, he said simply. You found me. You didn't give up. That's enough. It's a start, Richard corrected gently. But I want to spend the rest of my life proving that the man you remember, the one who taught you to fish and made pancakes and laughed too loud, that man is who I really am. That the person I became after you were gone was the lie, not the other way around. Maya, watching this moment between father and son, felt Vicente's hand on her shoulder. You did good, Misha, her grandfather whispered. You did real good. We all did, Maya replied. That's the point, isn't it? None of us could have done this alone. It took all of us, working together, caring together, believing together, to make this happen. As the stars came out over the Cumberland River and the gathering slowly wound down, there was a sense of completion that went beyond happy endings. This wasn't a fairy tale where everything was fixed and perfect. Lucas would still struggle with his identity and his trauma. Richard would still fight the business instincts that had defined him for so long. Maya would still be a kid in a modest house in Tennessee, dealing with the normal challenges of growing up. But they'd all been transformed by what had happened in those floodwaters and in the search that followed. They'd learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and diving in anyway. That family wasn't just blood. It was the people who chose to stand with you when everything fell apart. That redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to be better in every moment going forward. Years later, when Maya was older and writing her college application essays, she'd write about that day in the flood, not about heroism or bravery, but about choice. About the moment when she'd looked at a drowning man and decided that his life mattered, even when everyone else had decided it didn't. About how that one choice had led to a boy finding his way home, a family being restored, and communities learning to see each other as human again. She'd end that essay with the words she'd screamed into the roar of the flood that day, I won't let you die. Because sometimes, those 5 words are all it takes to change everything. To save a life, find a truth, restore a family, and prove that compassion isn't weakness, it's the strongest force in the world. The river kept flowing, as rivers do, carrying away the past while the future stretched out ahead of them like an unwritten story. And in that space between what was lost and what was found, between who they'd been and who they were becoming, there was hope. Real, solid, unshakable hope. The kind of hope that survives drowning,